And today it is my great honor to be able to introduce Professor John Creighton Campbell, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Michigan. He arrived here in 1973 after having finished his PhD at Columbia University, and he stayed at this institution throughout. Our football program has a motto which reads, those who stay will be champions. At CJS, those who stay will receive a medal from the Japanese government. And Professor Campbell was just honored on Tuesday, a couple nights ago. There was a special reception at the Consul General's residence in Detroit, in West Bloomfield, where he received the Order of the Rising Sun, gold raised with neck ribbon. It was a very touching tribute to all that he has accomplished. He will talk about his career and the research that he has conducted, so I'm not going to steal his thunder by laying out all that he has done, but he's an extremely humble, one of the most humble scholars, American scholars that I have ever, I didn't mean that I've ever encountered. So don't let him deceive you. He's a highly accomplished scholar, and his intellectual influence really crosses the Pacific. And he was also, and he has published a number of books, edited volumes, articles, and he has influenced the actual policy-making circles because he's fearless in his choice of topics, tackling issues like budget making in Japan, healthcare, elderly care. Those are very challenging topics, but he has done rigorous research on those issues and really impacted the policies in Japan along those lines. Also, probably equally or even more important in his heart, he has mentored a number of students, graduate students in particular, and University of Michigan Political Science Department has been known as a place to be if you want to study Japanese politics, thanks to his accomplishments and his efforts in raising all those young talents. I was just looking at his CV, and there's a long list of students whose dissertations he chaired, and it is really a who's who list of scholars, influential scholars that are working today who study Japanese politics, starting from Stephen Reed, who is really one of the founding fathers of election politics research in Japan, to Sueo Sudo, who is an expert on Southeast Asian politics, to more recent examples like Sota Kato, who runs the one of the largest think tanks in Asia, Tokyo Foundation of Policy Studies, and Yoshihide Soea, the leading expert on Korean Peninsula politics in Japan at Keio University. So we are very grateful for all that he has done to nurture all those young talents. And also I'll be remiss if I didn't mention that he directed the Center for Japanese Studies from 1982 to 1987, a very important period, a rapid growth that the CJS went through in that decade was largely thanks to John Campbell. So we are grateful for all that you have done for the CJS, the University of Michigan, and Japan Studies community. And without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor John Creighton Campbell.
Thank you very much. You will see this is kind of an old guy's talk. For one thing, to do it just to talk about your life and having to have PowerPoint in order to remember it as I go along is one side. Another is I managed to have the wrong date on the bottom of this slide. Worse still, I can't even subtract anymore. It's kind of embarrassing, but I will persevere, and I hope you will bear with me. And that's interesting. There we go. So why am I here? The opportunity is this award that Kyo kindly mentioned that I got the other day, and actually a really wonderful moment for me. Professor Tsui asked me to this event while I'm here and to either present some research or to talk about my career. And I decided to talk about my career which was maybe a mistake because this turned out to be extremely difficult to prepare. And in fact, the last slide in this talk was written about 25 minutes ago over at a doctor's office where my appointment before I came here. I'm ashamed to say because that's ridiculous. It's not that great a talk. But during my career, I've taught undergraduates, I've supervised graduate students, I was director of the CJS and had various projects here. Outside of the university, before coming here, I worked for the Social Science Research Council, Joint Committee on Japanese Studies in New York. And late in my career here, I was for 3 or 4 years the Secretary-Treasurer, which is actually the Executive Director of the Association for Asian Studies. But I've always considered that the core of what I'm about has been my research. And I want to talk about my 3 main projects, not in a super organized way. I'm not going to tell you all the findings of all those projects, but I just sort of some notion of how I got into them, what I thought I was up to, and that sort of a thing. I hope you'll find it interesting. I have an enormous number of slides. I'm going to go through them quickly, so if there's something I say that you don't understand, by all means stick your hand up. But if you have if you want to ask another question or something, please, if you'll hold till the end, I think we will have enough time for questions. Thank you. First, a prequel to all these research projects. I first noticed Japan in December 1958. You notice that is 60 years ago, not 50. And that was when the U.S. Army sent me to Okinawa. I'd enlisted in the Army after my freshman year at Columbia because I had done so badly academically. I like to think it's because I was a little too young. I was a year younger than others, but it was mostly because I spent most of my time fooling around at the campus radio station, WKCR. And then after I got in the Army, one reason I went in for 3 years was in order to choose my specialty. I was in journalism and then radio television, and I spent 1.5 years being a disc jockey and sometimes a TV newscaster and that sort of thing in Okinawa, their old all-night disc jockey, which was a lot of fun. But somehow or other, I found Japan entrancing without thinking about it much, but I really liked it. I tried to stay longer, but the Army thought I probably should go home, so they sent me home to Fort Meade, Maryland, which was nowhere near as entrancing. But in any case, in 1962, I got out of the Army. I got married to my wife, Ruth, to whom I'm still married and is sitting over there. And I went back to Columbia as a freshman. I'd flunked German in my, as a sophomore, I flunked German in my disastrous freshman year, and I figured I already had a head start on Japanese for my language requirements since I knew about 10 words, 5 or so which could be used in polite company. As long as I was taking language, I thought I should take other stuff too. So I took Japanese literature 2 terms with the late Donald Keene, who died about 3 weeks ago and was a great inspiration to everybody, but also in history and sociology, in economics, in politics, and art history, I think, or whatever. So when I graduated in 1965, I was already sort of a Japan specialist, certainly more than anything else, but I really didn't know where I was going, what I wanted to do. But in my senior year, James W. Morley, a great man who was my advisor, he said, you know, you could probably go study Japanese in Japan if you want to. And he, you know, told me what to do, and I applied and was accepted and got a fellowship to go to the Inter-University Center, which at the time was in Mitaka in Tokyo. Later it was in downtown Tokyo, and now it's in Yokohama. And we went off to there with our 2-month-old son, 2 months after he was born. We had a wonderful time in Japan, particularly Ruth did. She was just saying the other day that's when she fell in love with Japan, and she has been ever since. But in my case, it was a great shock to get there after I had taken 4 years of Japanese at Columbia. And I couldn't say anything. It was awful. It was just terrible. I could read Maruyama Masao, but as far as having a conversation with anybody, forget about it. That wouldn't be true of somebody who went through Japanese at Michigan, of course, but Columbia in the old days was a very traditional kind of a program. But nonetheless, we all love Japan. And somehow in the process of all this, I decided to go to graduate school and to become a Japan specialist political scientist. I went back to Columbia for my graduate work. I actually didn't think of any place else I might go. I didn't apply anyplace else, but we got into public housing so we could live. I had a bit of a fellowship. We had 2 kids by then. I didn't take many Japan courses as a graduate student because I'd taken almost all of them as an undergraduate. So I did more on political science and some economics and other stuff. I fleetingly was interested in radical politics in America because I was at Columbia in the spring of 1968, which is next to only Berkeley, more or less where I live now, as the center of, you know, I don't know what you call it, the revolution here in America. But I didn't stay very interested in that. What I got interested in these studies was decision making, how public decisions, how the government makes up its mind, such as Richard Neustadt's course on the American presidency and a lot of other stuff based on case studies. And I also worked a little on fiscal policy. Before too long, it was time to pick out a dissertation topic. So what should I do for a dissertation? At that time, because of what was going on in Japan, which was a lot of stuff about local social movements and so forth, the focus among Americans who looked at Japan was largely on local level stuff of my cohort, my compatriots. And I started out thinking that's what people are doing, so I'll do that. So I hit on the idea of writing about the Komeito party, which was just getting started and it wasn't really much established in national politics yet, but it was in the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly. And I thought that might be interesting to look at. I had a slight tie with Komeito because I had been shakubuku'd, if you'll pardon the expression. I had been sort of recruited, sort of into the Soka Gakkai when we were there in language school because the next door neighbor were members and they were always taking me to meetings and everything. I even went to Daigo Honsama over a weekend once. And also I have felt some vague sense of collection. Komeito is the political party of the Soka Gakkai, so that's the connection. So that seemed like a reasonable thing. But in my last term of coursework, which was the spring of '68, I was reading a book in a course by Wallace Sayer, a wonderful course called The Political Context of Public Administration. And I read this book by Aaron Rudolsky called The Politics of the Budgetary Process. And I had one of those genuine aha moments. It's a terrific book. It's a very famous book in American politics. And it's a terrific book, and I read it and I thought, boy, that's what I think of as politics, not some new political party moving in the Tokyo Parliamentary Assembly, which is when I think about it. I've been interested in it since, and I wasn't then. It's not very interesting. But I thought, can I apply the theory of this book, which is a theory usually called incrementalism? Will that apply to Japan? So I wrote up a new proposal. I'd already submitted the old proposal to the Foreign Area Fellowship Program, and I was slated for an interview. So I assumed they would, they accepted my proposal. They say, okay, that's okay, just come to the interview. I came to the interview, and they hadn't told the interviewees. So 3 distinguished professors. So they were all prepared to talk to me about Tokyo politics and the Komeito, but I said, no, I've changed my mind. I'm going to do budgeting in Japan. And oh, okay, they said, and they went along. It certainly was a much better idea. Now a mentor, and for anybody doing research in Japan, the senior Japanese scholars or people in our fields that have, in so many cases, gone so far out of their way to help us and introduce us to people and give us advice and teach us things is amazing. And so when I was on my way to Japan, I stopped in Berkeley and to talk to Aaron Wadowski. He was the chairman of the political science department, I think then. And it was a very interesting talk, and I liked that. And he said to me, there's this guy in Japan who's translating my book into Japanese, and he keeps writing to me with all these things that he doesn't understand. And maybe you could go over and help him out a little bit with budget language, but more, it was kind of an informally written book about congressional committees and all that stuff, and it is hard to understand. So I said, sure, that'd be a pleasure. So I went and met him, and he helped me. He turned out to help me enormously with both explanations of what was going on in Japan and with many, many introductions. Oh, I should have said. He was a researcher in the Legislative Reference and Research Bureau of the National Diet Library, which means he did policy research for typically opposition party diet men. The LDP had the government do it, but they did it in that bureau for other people. So he knew everybody and knew all about, particularly local finance and local government were his specialties, but also budgeting. So he was an enormous help to me. Now, why was this topic important and interesting in the budget? Why did I pick that topic? Well, in general, Harold Lasswell, who's a very famous, long-dead political scientist, defined politics as who gets what, when, and how. In my doctoral defense, Gerald Curtis asked me, why is your thing politics anyway? What do you mean talking about budgeting? He asked me later when I came back. And I said, well, Harold Lasswell said that who gets what, when, and how is the essence of politics, and that's what budgeting is about. And then I later discovered a well-known Japanese political scientist of the day named Ito Daiichi, who said, and this is worth quoting, I think, what is characteristic of Japan these days is that while the principle of party government is in force, seems like it's party government, in actuality, as a result of the parties having lost the capability of policy decision-making, the rules of the budgetary compilation process has, as they stand, necessarily come to substitute for the rules of policy decision-making. The point is, in the American budget system that Wadowski wrote about, it was very important. But in Japan, it was even more important because there wasn't that much other kind of policy making that amounted to anything. So, and in particular, the question for Japanese political scientists that analyze government has always been who runs Japan, the bureaucrats or the politicians, the bureaucracy or the LDP, an endless, largely sterile debate, but it's what people were interested in. There's no better place to see that than in the budget. So in that sense, I thought it was a good topic. Now, 1969, 1970, yes?
Why did the political parties in Japan lose their...
That's a very good question. I'm not even going to answer that at the end of the lecture, let alone now. But, I mean, it's a generally, it's not actually altogether true, but it's a widespread image that these politicians only care about money and favors and get reelected and don't really care about public policy. So that's what Ito was thinking when he wrote that. So it was a big research project, as it turned out. I did over 100 interviews, mostly with government officials, largely in the Ministry of Finance, but also in the other ministries, as well as numbers of politicians, particularly LDP politicians. They were much involved. Various representatives of interest groups that are interested in budgeting. I transcribed all these interviews into Japanese. The interviews ran an hour to an hour and a half. Transcribing them took 5 hours each. Ruth would tell you I sat there in my study in our little house up there, yang, listening on the tape and typing. We didn't have computers then, typing it on a typewriter. And then beyond that, I spent endless days in the National Diet Library, not the Legislative Reference Research Bureau, but the Kokai Toshokan Shimbun Kirinukishitsu, which are the big morgue of all newspaper articles on everything. Has recently been discontinued because everything's computerized, and it's a shame because it was wonderful to pick up these big books. 3 volumes of clippings for every year of the budget, and when my dissertation research I looked at 17 years. So it was weeks and weeks, but I certainly learned a lot about budget vocabulary, and I could read Japanese budget articles as quick as I could read English before very long. It all seemed like a lot of work. I mean, it was a lot of work, but it really was fun. I mean, I'd never done anything before but write, you know, little research papers in school or something or other, and to really do a research project, and it got more interesting as I went along. And the process of meeting all these people, scary as anything, to get yourself up in the morning and out of the house to go down and interview somebody at the Ministry of Finance is daunting, but you do it, and you know, it works. Whoops, I'm sorry. So what did I find out? Very briefly, the incremental model invented in the United States works better in Japan than it does in the United States. Why so? It's actually sort of related to what I was saying to you. What it means is the incremental model says that the budget is 100,000 individual decisions about this program gets so much money, that program gets so much money, and so forth. So it's a lot of decisions that would be impossible to make, you know, for not just for any one person, but even on some rational basis by an organization. So everywhere in the world, not just the US and Japan, it's handled by what could be called incrementalism, which is you take last year's budget for granted, and then you say, maybe this should go up for some reason and that should go down for some reason, or maybe we start something new in there, but it's all within the framework of what people were doing last year. If you've ever worked in an office, responsible for managing something, it's the same way. Well, we need a little more of this and a little less of that. So that fewer big changes in Japan, more consistency from year to year. And so therefore, the budget shares of particular programs or of government ministries or bureaus or whatever were much more constant over time than was true in the United States. Well, why was that? That argument was actually in the conclusion of my dissertation. I didn't worry that much about why during the middle part of it, but I thought of three possibilities. One was the political structure of Japan, and this is actually sort of related to the same point, that there's nothing in Japan that's sort of like presidential leadership, or for that in the US, or for that matter, prime ministerial leadership in England, which they used to have until this week, and or this year or last year. But not that much top-down decision-making. A lot is just left up to the bureaucracy, or I should say to the bureaucracy and then to the committees of LDP politicians that are specialized in these particular sorts of topics. But there's not much change coming from the top. So that's one explanation. Another is Japan was, most of the period I was looking at were the 60s. The 60s is the high growth period in Japan. With high economic growth, government revenues go up every year, just from normal taxation. Actually, they cut taxes every year, but still the revenues kept going up. So they had a lot of money to spend. And when you've got a lot of money to spend, it sort of saves you from worrying too much. It's just as easy to give everybody the same thing they had last year. It's not a big deal. So that was the second explanation. And the third was more cultural. And among my compatriots in Japanese social science, I have been more interested in looking at sides of how the Japanese are different because they're Japanese or some sorts of cultural factors than most other people. The social scientist is really supposed to reject those sorts of, with many exceptions. Kitayama sensei isn't here happily, so I don't have to confront him with this. He's not like that. But generally speaking, that's not the way people operate. But I thought a cultural explanation based on conflict avoidance, avoiding clear-cut questions and answers and making everything a little vague. That also sort of fits into this thing. I didn't say which one of these was most important. I didn't know, but I think it is a kind of question that's worth considering when we look at these Japanese phenomena. Okay, when I say strategy here, I mean my own strategy, not budget agency strategies or anything. This is a big question that various people face at the young stage in their career, is submit or revise. That is to say, I defended my dissertation in 1973, happily, partly because of my connections at the SSRC, at the Joint Committee for Japanese Studies. I had better connections than most, and it was Chalmers Johnson who arranged to have the University of California Press look at my manuscript, and they liked it enough and they accepted it before I even defended, which, for those of you that have been in a PhD program, you can't think of anything better than having your dissertation accepted for publication before you go in to defend it. Nobody called me humble then. Arrogant was the word that came to mind for everybody. But in any case, the press had only asked for minor revisions, so I could have just sent it in then and they would have published it. But I thought I'd written it pretty hastily. I didn't have that much time to do it, and it was kind of a complicated manuscript, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, my dissertation research, I came back in 1970, and so the 1970 budget year was the last one that I looked at. But then in 1971, we had Tanaka Kakue come in. Tanaka Kakue was the biggest spender ever, and he really demolished the budget process in a sense. And then we were followed by the oil shock. And after the oil shock for the 1974 budget process, revenues were very tight, and it was run by Takeo Fukuda, one of the more conservative guys around. So there was this big contrast in what was the 60s had been high growth but sort of uneventful, but here we had a lot of stuff going on. So the question of how that got reflected in the budget, which it was a lot, was very interesting. So I needed to go back to study that. So I went back in the summer of '74 to update, and I spent until 1976 some time in rewriting. And in terms of getting tenure, which was not an easy enough thing, not such an easy process for me, that was not a very good choice. Typical advice you give a graduate student is, it's your dissertation. If you can get it published, send it in, get it published, then go do something else. And don't worry about it. It's not going to get that much better. But I thought it did get a fair amount better, so I wasn't unhappy about that. So the book was called Contemporary Japanese Budget Politics. It's came out in 1977. Paperback came out in 1981. As I say, my first shot was my best shot. I look back at that book, I just did again. I do from time to time. And I was amazed how smart I used to be and how hard I worked to gather all that stuff. I mean, it's the whole national budget process. It really was a big project. Certainly this has been my most read book in English, and by Americans, but particularly by Japanese. In fact, it was 5 years before the translation came out. Akira Kojima, the person I was just talking about, translated it as well as all the other stuff that he did for me. It's published by Simul Press in 1984. So it was 6 or 7 years that it was only available in English, but still it was very widely read by Japanese political scientists and by graduate students because there really wasn't a study like that of such an intensive study of a big decision-making process. There were case studies, but nothing so comprehensive. About one of the two most flattering things that have happened to me, I'll tell you the other one later, is that just recently, actually published in 2014, the same book was retranslated from scratch by someone who was much more of an academic political scientist than Kojima-san had been, Mabuchi Masaru, who's a well-known Kyoto public administration and political science guy. He translated for Keiso Shobo because they had a series called Political Science Classics. Now, translating the same book again and publishing it in something in Political Science Classics, that's almost better than the Order of the Rising Sun. You know, I mean, that was really, really something. But you know, it was a good book, and I hope that, from an academic point of view, it was a book that took social science theories, a particular kind of theory, fairly seriously, and I wasn't particularly working creatively with the theory of incrementalism. I'm not sure I said anything new about it, but I think I applied it very well in an environment totally different from anything that had been written before and saw that it worked. So on the one hand, I think that was a good test of the theory. On the other hand, I think it threw a lot of light on Japan, and the implicit comparisons with the United States threw a lot of light on Japan that wouldn't have been if I had just sort of walked in blankly, you know, to the budget process and said, what's going on here? Second strike. Did they use that in other departments? That's what the political scientists always call it. Does it sound familiar to you? Second strike is what the political science department referred to as what you have to do to get tenure, which is you have to have a good dissertation and you have to do something with your dissertation. That's why they hired you, right? But that's water under the bridge. So you have to come up with another substantial project and have some ideally publications for it. It used to be said you should have a second book, but nobody ever said that really. But article, something or other, you have to have a substantial second piece of research if you have any hope of getting tenure. Now I'm up to 75 when I'm still finishing the revisions of my book a little bit, but I had to come up with another grant proposal to write, to go off to Japan to do another piece of research, to write another something to get tenure, and I'd have to do it pretty quick. So what should I do? First idea I had was the politics of the tax system in Japan. Never been done by a political scientist. Had never been done then, has never been done since. It's not that easy to do, but it's really important. As you might imagine, we know in America how important the politics of the tax system is, and it's just as important in Japan. And it's a continuity for me, but it was hard to face going back for another year to the Ministry of Finance, for one thing. It's not the friendliest place in the world. And, but more academically, like expenditure policy, taxation policy is kind of the same from year to year. It changes very slowly. It's a part of the way governments stay stable, and it seemed to be more interesting to study policy change rather than spending all my life working on instruments of policy stability. So then, what to do? Come on, what? That did it. In doubt, always hit escape. So I wound up with old age policy. Well, why old age policy? Well, the early 1970s in Japan were the first old people boom. We called that there, not just my word. In that period, the topic of older people came up as being a really serious national concern, a lot of hubbub. A famous novel, Kokotsuno, was published around then that everybody read, and it was about a man in dementia and the problems for his caretakers. And a lot of public policy came along. There were political reasons for this too. It was a very and Tanaka was there. It was a very lively political time. But in a period of a couple of years, they installed this amazingly expensive system of free medical care for older people. Older people had always been covered by health insurance, national health insurance, not like the US where they didn't have anything. But they had basically a 50% copay and a lot of out-of-pocket expenses, and they just made it all free. No copays, no premiums. Well, premiums, but the premiums were very small. So free medical care for older people is a very big issue. They also doubled the size of pensions. Not the size of the pensions that people were getting right then, but they doubled the future pension benefits, which is obviously an enormous change. And then across the government and all sorts of ministries, they all came up with all these little programs or medium-sized programs to serve older people, to respond to this public, I guess we could say, to respond to this public clamor about doing better with older people. So this was in a lot of ways, this was 75, I was thinking about this. This seemed to be the biggest area of policy change that there was in the Japanese government and would be worth studying. And then another point is that by this time, Ruth had been working for a decade or even longer as a gerontological social worker. So she'd been doing research, but mostly practice on old age stuff, including working here at the University of Michigan in the year or two before the Turner Geriatric Clinic was established. So she's very much into this field, and I thought, wow, this is great, we can work together. I would do all this top-down policy making, from the Tokyo point of view, and she'd be down there in the grassroots looking at old people and their caregivers and social workers and what they do, and we could do a lot of stuff together. Seemed like a great idea. So to design the project, the problem was I needed something really quick. So I thought I could go to the field for a year and write something up for 6 months and take 6 months to get it published in some prestigious journal. So in order to do a project quickly, I decided to identify the most recent new or greatly expanded programs in the last few years, in 70, 75 or whatever, and then to go and find out from the people who were there, usually the officials and others, how did it happen? The topic itself is not that super important in the sense that these are mostly small programs. I guess free medical care would be included, but most of these are small programs that don't really affect people's lives all that much. But, I made a guess old people policy was probably going to become more important pretty soon, and so in that sense it had some significance. But the political science question of how can this new priority affect officials and others all throughout the government is not such a bad question. So, getting it underway. In 1975, I hastily wrote a Fulbright application. In writing the application, I made the project look a little broader than that, but nonetheless, I said what I was going to do, and I got it. And from some connection or another that I've forgotten, the Social Security Research Institute, the Shakai Hosho Kenkyujo, agreed to be my sponsor. It's a public research institute. Like there are a lot of them in Japan. The people that work for the government. Happily, the research director there at the time was Miura Fumio. Miura Fumio, who is a wonderful person. He was a leading scholar. He had introduced all sorts of new ideas to Japan in the welfare field. He was also the boss, as we say in Japan, of the aging world, because anybody that needed to get a job or do anything, create a new program or something, they'd always call him up first and he'd tell them what to do. He was like the Mayor Daley of old age policy in Japan. And he took me under his wing and he introduced me to everybody and he gave me suggestions and he sent me off here and there and had me go to conferences and it was terrific. If I had his backing, you know, anybody would talk to me. So we had a very full year in Tokyo. I had a desk at the Social Science Research Institute, which was then, well, it still is. It was a little teeny brick building in back of the new, relatively new Kasumi Gaseki building, the first skyscraper in Tokyo. And it's since been built into another skyscraper itself, although the office is still there. But now they're just one floor. Here, you walked up the stairs to the third floor to these pokey little offices. And there Miura was some of the time, and I was some of the time with the desk. I started interviewing people and reading stuff. At the same time, Ruth had gotten a fellowship from the Japan Foundation for working on old age stuff. That allowed us enough money to rent a house between two fellowships in fashionable Futaku Tamagawa for our boys to go to, who were now in 4th and 6th grade, to go to fashionable St. Mary's around the corner there. Our daughter Judy, who had been born in Japan when we were there before, was now at 1st to 2nd grade level, and she went to Seto Shogakko, and after a while managed to function in Japanese. Ruth was working full-time at the Tokyo Metropolitan Institute of Gerontology, the To Rojinken. Her boss was Maeda Daisaku. Actually, maybe along with Miura, those were the two major factors in kind of old age policy issues in Japan. And another absolutely wonderful person, and he was the co-author of the only book then written in English on Japan called The Honorable Elders, which was a book co-written with Elmore Palmore, who is a well-known American gerontologist. So he was a real expert, and he was a big help to me as well. Did Ruth and I really work together? No, not really. Our ways of thinking are quite different. We've written, I think, 2 articles together, and one of them we wrote together, and the other one I wrote, and she talked to me about and signed. But she's written tons of stuff on her own. But nonetheless, we did go to site visits together. We went around a lot. We talked a lot. And I think I'm confident to say that for both of us, the fact that we were both working on this highly related topics, even if from different angles, worked very well. So we really did have a wonderful 12 months in Tokyo. And then we got to take our 2 boys went home. Our daughter at 6 went to stay with some neighbors for a while. And we went to Kochi in Shikoku and had a wonderful month running around in a car by the guy, not that I think of this young guy who worked for the local social welfare council, because Miura sensei had called him up and say, Campbell's coming down, get one of the young guys to drive him all over the place. And so he did, so we could study aging in rural Japan and what some of these programs I'd been studying were doing in rural plan. So, with regard to my research plan for these little bits of programs and figuring them out, I quickly ran into trouble. At the start, my questions here had come from the sort of 2 conventional theories that we all think about when the government does something, when policy changes. One is there's some social problem comes up. In a technocratic way, the government looks at this problem and it comes up with some solution and does it. That's kind of technocratic. The other way is that when some new program gets started, it's because some bunch of citizens, an organized interest group or a social movement or something or other, some bunch of people come down and say, do this, do this, do this, and the government, for whatever reason, yields and does something. Those are the 2 ways we just normally assume that things change. So I based my questions on trying to figure out which is the better explanation for the things, these programs I was looking at, and the answers I didn't fit into these boxes at all. I would phrase questions like that, and the guys would just kind of look at me. Who did what in the way this program came about and why they were doing it was really ambiguous. So instead of asking directed questions, I started just asking for this program started last year. What happened? You know, who was around? Did you hear from anybody about this program? What were you thinking about? Just collect these people's stories about what happened and figure I'd rather than being able to put it down on a table, I could figure out later how it worked. Now, to step back a bit, actually to go back to Ann Arbor, mentally, not physically, at this time, well, I started out talking about incrementalism. Incrementalism is one kind of governmental decision making, and in a sense, it's one of the many ways people have pointed out that public decision making does not work in the sort of textbook rational way we think that people are supposed to make decisions. Actually, individuals don't work that way either, but certainly governments don't. And there's a long literature on this, and incrementalism is one. It's not rational. It's you do next year's and change it a little bit. There are other variants on this, or not variants, but other developments of this, and particularly in my department, Jack Walker, who became my good friend and was department chair and unfortunately was killed in an auto accident. And then John Kingdon, we're working on a way of approaching decision making, usually called agenda setting, that was about a much more fluid way of the way issues come and go and may or may not get enacted or enacted in some other form. John Kingdon's book was called Agendas, Alternatives in Public Policy. It actually succeeded Wadowski's book, as it happens, as being the most famous political science book. It won a prize for this in Washington among people that really did policy as to what really looked like reality. It's a wonderful book. John lives down the street from me now, and not the street, down the peninsula from me in the Bay Area, and we see him every now and then, and it's really great. So there were a lot of these ideas about problems and solutions and how they get, as I say, Jack Walker's research was partly on innovation and diffusion research. So there was a lot of action here, a lot of people thinking about how these things worked, and I was really interested in that. So that was one side on the approach, and then on the scope of the decision. I had this bunch of 50 or so policy changes that happened over 5 years. Most of them were kind of small. So what? Is it really all that interesting or important? It seemed kind of bloodless without having the context of what it all meant for real people. It would be better to make a story somehow of how big problems and solutions had come over the years, how they changed over time, and include in there a lot of description of what actually happened, what that people could read to actually see how it worked. And I finally came up with a framework for doing this, drawing on these disciplinary things. Oh, sorry. So the framework in terms of the content I eventually got to was to see this is the whole history. My book cut off in 1990, but from 1952. It started in, I went back to 1952, the beginning of the occupation period. And I came to see it this way, that the first big quote, problem about aging that became important in Japan, you can call the rogo mondai, or the aging problem, which means people worrying about, I'm going to get old, who's going to take care of me? The background thought is always the family system is falling apart, which it wasn't necessarily, but that was a very, very big concern. And the response to that was basically these big expansions of pensions, which went on through a whole more than 20-year period and wound up with these big expansions in 1972 that I mentioned before. So that's one category, one problem and one category of policy. The second one, which was the one I was really writing about, was called the Rojin Mondai, the old people problem, which is what do we do with all these frail old people? The number of older people is growing and growing, and as I say, everybody thought the family system was falling apart, and what are we going to do with all these people? They have all these medical problems and they have all these care problems. So there was a substantial expansion of home helpers and nursing homes and all of those sorts of policies for people. And as I say, free medical care so that their health care wouldn't be impossibly expensive. In the period from basically 1963, that was the passage of the Rojin Fukushiho, the old age welfare law that sort of kicked it off, up till 1976. And I analyzed a lot about how that happened. I think that was pretty interesting. The third problem is the aging society problem. And you've all heard this one. This is the Koreika Shakai Mondai. And that's the problem that all of these old people are going to eat us out of house and home. How can we pay for their care? How can we pay their pensions? How, they're not working anymore. It's horrible. It's going to be this enormous burden. And I put the close date on that from, the 1990, because that's when the book ended, but that's just as true today. I think I saw a newspaper story yesterday about the burden of all these old people in Japan is going to go drive the country to the dogs. It's a familiar journalistic trope, and it has been since about 1976, which is it's always right around the corner. Any day now, the world is going to come to an end because of all these old people. So it did lead to a lot of policies that tried, at least, to cut back and economize and lessen this burdens for the future up till about 1990. So that's the broad pattern of what was going on. Of course, I take 400 pages to describe all these policies and stuff in there. I won't go into that. Now, what I was doing sort of theoretically with all this, my model, was that for each of these policy changes, I tried to work through the decision-making system and figure out alternative explanations for what was going on. It's a very elaborate theory. As I say here, if I wanted to go into, if I had another hour, I could talk about it, but there's no point in even getting to it. I like it. I liked it then. I like it now. But the question of whether it really should have been stuck into a detailed history of Japanese old age policy is another problem. The writing process for the book, back here in 1977-79, I was teaching. I was trying to get the publications program started at the CJS. I wasn't the director yet. I was going through tenure with some Sturmendrang. I managed to write one article for the Journal of Japanese Studies, which was sort of my original project. And then I got a Wilson Fellowship, a Wilson Foundation, what do you call it, Woodrow Wilson Center Fellowship, to go to Washington and sit around for a month in the Castle building of this, for a year, for the Castle building of the Smithsonian, and in theory, finish up my project, which was already 6 years old. But in fact, I didn't really write anything, but I read a lot, I thought a lot. I talked with Jack Walker, who was there at the same time, and I thought a lot about policy change theories and the literature thereof. So it was a pretty good year. Ruth got to be a Chevy Chase housewife in suburban Maryland and work at the Maryland Gerontology Center for a while. Anyway, the manuscript for this book was mostly finished by 1988, roughly its bar mitzvah. It had been started 13 years before. A lot of time in wrestling with the theoretical things and a lot of time in trying to catch up, because a lot was going on in old age policy in the 80s, and it would seem crazy it was really interesting, so I kept going back, 2 or 3 times and trying to sort out and working it out. So I was able to wind up at the end of it by describing not just the economizing reforms, particularly of pensions and medical care in the late 1980s, but also get to the Gold Plan in 1990, which was a big attempt at expansion and sort of led into the future. But that's where my book ended. The book was called How Policies Changed the Japanese Government and the Aging Society. It was published by Princeton in 1992. It actually won the Ohira Prize, although lots of books won the Ohira Prize. But it never sold anything much. Princeton wouldn't put out a paperback until 10 years later. The fundamental problem with the book, anybody interested in policy change theory, there aren't very many of them, but they're virtually all Americans, have no interest in wanting to read all the details about Japanese old age programs. And people that are really interested in Japanese old age programs, most of them Japanese, but including Americans, could care less about policy change theory. So the book actually, the number of ideal readers was me. And almost nobody else, and it showed up. I mean, that's what it is. I still think the thing was worthwhile. It is the most comprehensive collection of detailed decision-making studies in any one policy area, in a given policy area, that certainly has ever been done for Japan in any language. And it actually turned out to be a solid history of the development, a history rather than a work of hypothesis testing social science. The development of a key sector of public policy. And I can't resist reading to you, which I just rediscovered again last week, the best book review I ever got by a long shot, which is by Arnold Heidenheimer, a very distinguished scholar of public policy, particularly in Germany, nothing about Japan, at Washington University. And he wrote this in APSR, American Political Science Review, the absolute #1 journal, in 1993. And I quote, he first, I'm embarrassed to do this, but I'm not that humble. He first talked a lot about my policy change theory, which he liked a lot. But then he said, turning from the innovative to the mundane aspects of goals, it may be said that Campbell presents a superbly detailed and finely crafted descriptive analysis of several decades of development in the several policy areas bearing on elderly policy. The analysis seems as inclusive as it could possibly get, I'll say, and for the first time opens up the internal dynamics of Japanese social policy making to the non-Japanologist. I mean, that is a good review. And I did it. As I say, he liked the theory, but it was just what I like to think of as really solidly grounded history. And this happened, and then that happened. Why did this lead to this, and then what happened? That kind of analysis that is in the book. Project 3, briefly, healthcare. Medical care is obviously a big part of old age policy. Chapter and a half of my How Policies Change book was about first free medical care and then later on the reforms in medical care to try to cut back. I could write those okay, but they were hard, and I found that I did not have a sense of the overall politics of healthcare in Japan, which was different than everybody else. I came back and learned it's true in the US too. Healthcare politics in the US isn't like anything else in the US either, and it's not like healthcare politics in Japan. But it is a very funny sector. And then, of course, I had the practical problem that here it was in 1987, and I needed to have a new project. So I wrote another Fulbright proposal, this one about how health policy decisions get made. Not knowing that much about Japan and the literature, there's no literature on Japanese healthcare then by political scientists. I drew the concepts from the US healthcare politics literature, although they didn't apply very well, and the approach worked for getting me the grant. And then I went as a visiting professor to the Keio Law School in 1989, but the concepts didn't help me very much out in understanding what was going on, and I was kind of floundering. But luckily, some people came along to help me out. First, Sone Yasunori, well-known political scientist at Keio, didn't know anything about healthcare, but he did know a lot about decision making in Japan. He was my sponsor. Masuyama Mikitaka, who one or two of you here probably know, was his Zemi-star as an undergraduate, and then his MA student, and he was working on aging and health policy making topics, and he became my research assistant thanks to Sone Sensei, and he helped a lot. And then Ikegami Naoki of the Keio Medical School, he was and he is Japan's leading expert on health economics and policy. I introduced him to myself. If anybody that was here the night heard this, but I called him up on the phone. He didn't know who I was. I explained who I was and what I was doing and what I was interested in my really lousy Japanese over the telephone. I mean, not lousy, but very clumsy. And he listened patiently for 10 or 15 minutes, and he said, you can speak in English if you'd rather. It turned out he'd been raised and educated in England, and so he and I, despite that, became fast friends and worked together quite a lot. Naoki's main raison d'etre, this is his field, health policy, and he felt keenly that the Japanese medical system was not taken seriously around the world. And a lot of people in Japan were annoyed about this, but he was in particular because he was the sort of, many fields in Japan have their sort of foreign relations guy. There's a scholar, because he has good English and because he's good and eminent and people respect him, that he sort of becomes the spokesman for the field. And he was that for the health policy field, even though most people in the field disagreed with him, but they didn't speak good enough English to take this role. He wrote good English, Naoki, and he had published in English, but to write a professional article for a top-right journal is another thing, not just the language itself, but the way that you do it. So he and I together wrote articles describing the system and its successes, universal care, low cost, other stuff, for the New England Journal of Medicine and then for Health Affairs. Those are the two leading journals in health policy. in the late 1980s. And we even went to write a book. At the time, health reform, you all remember Hillary Care, right? Well, if you're old enough, you remember that fleeting moment of non-event of Hillary Care. It was in the news a lot, and we thought, gee, the Americans really should look at the Japanese model, which had some lessons that Europe and other places that people did know about didn't really have. So we planned a book. We divvied up the chapters for first drafts. We endlessly rewrote. We were in different continents. We rewrote chapters back and forth by email. We met once in Europe. We met in Mackinac Island up here for some reason in a hotel. We met in San Francisco for a week, in Japan for here and there to work together on this. I did not actually do that much primary research in this chapter because Naoki knew, or at least he thought he knew, everything worthwhile about the healthcare system. And I certainly read, but he was certainly the source of the information. But I did have a lot to do with the book. I just noticed in looking at it, Chapter 2 is called Actors, Arenas, and Agendas in Health Policy Making. I mean, Naoki couldn't have come up with that chapter title in a million years. That's straight out of the kind of political science research I do, and that's through the book. But it was really a genuine collaboration. I've never really had that much experience in collaborating well with people for whatever reason, but this was really a mark. Most of the book is descriptive. The innovative part of it, and this is all basically his stuff, innovative either in English or in Japanese, was the argument that the costs in Japan were so low because of the fee schedule they had that covered everything, and how that got negotiated between the government and the Japan Medical Association in this long, iterative process of balanced power that's gone on over the years, and we have that in some detail. We wrote the book in English. Again, his English is very good. It's all written in English. And we sent it off to Cambridge University Press. And then he translated the English book into Japanese, and we sent it off to Chuo Koron Shinsho, the low-priced, I can show you that. Excuse me, camera. This is the English version, The Art of Balance in Health Policy. Then the Japanese version, he translated the English to the Japanese, and we sent it off to Chuo Koron Shinsho, and they published it. The Japanese version came out in 1996. The English version came out in 1998. So much for the efficiencies of publications programs. But this is Nihon no Ryo. You see, it's a little paperback. It was cheap. It sold in railroad stations and everything, and it sold 80,000 copies. It was a very, very popular and kind of influential book. So a big success in many respects. So to the end, thereafter, the last event in my book on old people was the Gold Plan. That was an LDP campaign promise for an enormous expansion of long-term care. It was a super popular program. It was very expensive, but it was very expensive, and it was administratively very awkward. So the government replaced it with the excellent public mandatory long-term care insurance system, Kaigo Hoken, which started in the year 2000. Ruth and I both followed this pretty closely. Before and after we retired in 2006 and moved to Tokyo, we spent lots of time site visits, talking with people, going to conferences, and dealing with long-term care. I was just telling somebody, one of the real capstones of my career was doing a talk at a national annual conference of specialists in long-term care that got together in some town in Japan for 2 days of lectures and stuff, and I did a lecture on the politics of the long-term care system in Japan in Japanese to an audience of all specialists, and just did it without coming out as an American at all. And that was quite an achievement for me. It certainly took a long time to prepare. And whether they understood it or not, I don't know. But in any case, they were very polite. And, you know, that was to participate. It's really, in a long sense, for a long time, had been kind of a career goal of mine, was to be, certainly I would like to impress political scientists in America, whether or not they care anything about Japan. I didn't do great with that, but okay. But, and of course, among my colleagues in the Japanese studies professions here, but to go to a specialized topic like that in Japan and be able to function, you know, along with regular Japanese experts in the field and do a talk and be accepted, that really did mean a lot to me. It's too bad. If I could have postponed the book another 5 years, I could have written the last chapter about this program, because the way it came about fit exactly into my model and would have been a wonderful thing to explain. But in fact, I never did really write another big academic thing after that. Ruth and I both wrote lots of papers or some articles and many, many talks and all to talk about Japanese long-term care and as well as the insurance system and other stuff. But most of it was kind of straight policy, trying to describe things and draw lessons to them for Americans, which it seems to me in retrospect was a perfectly good way to wind up my career. Thank you very much.
We have 10, 15 minutes for questions. So if you could raise your hand.
Do the Japanese rely on a lot of immigrants as far as the home care and stuff like that? Because I know there's a lot of Filipinos over there working.
Here.
In Japan, there's a lot. Just for the house care.
It's one of the most controversial issues right now. No, as is well known, Japan has been pretty resistant to immigrants. But there's a lot going on, and they're starting a new program to bring more people in, and one of the designated sectors, it's construction, agriculture, small manufacturing. One of them is old age care, and we're going to see how it works. They've had a highly controlled program to bring trained people in from Philippines, Indonesia, and I guess Vietnam then, which is small numbers and has had various problems. People had to learn very good Japanese and pass an exam, which wasn't easy, but it's clearly loosening up now. But where it is, one of the reasons, I mean, Japanese don't have many foreign work, well, they have a lot of foreign workers, but it's an interesting thing. Around the world, old age care is something that's done by foreigners in lots and lots of places, one way or another. And in some countries, like in France, for example, they're working in institutions and they're participating in public programs where they're not exactly government employees, but they're in a structured kind of a program that has regulations and supervision. At the other extreme are countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, and several others, and European countries where most of the care is done by maids. I mean, in other words, by basically unskilled people who are hired one way or another for foreign countries. They may have to give up their passports. They may be sleeping in the kitchen. They may be working 13-day, 2 weeks and stuff. No protections of any sort. The profession in Japan, with the big expansion of programs, there grew up a profession of, there have always been social workers, but more care workers, associations of home helpers, of care managers, which is a Japanese institution. And they're not very powerful politically, but yet their message that this is a little too much to say a profession, but yet it's a skilled and important social function and deserves respect and deserves at least some money. They don't get paid as well as nurses, let alone some other people, but yet it's a respectable kind of salary. And it's one of the ingredients of that has been that they resisted, but the society in general resisted a lot of foreigners coming in. But I think it is probably changing now. Anything else? Old people, political science?
I have a question.
Oh, okay.
You mentioned several times that you've worked over the years with Ruth, your wife.
Right.
Oh, thank you. I was wondering if you had any words of wisdom for people who were interested in working with partners or spouses.
Why don't you ask Ruth? I'm low on wisdom. Well, there are people, I mean, we all know, or at least I know, husbands and wives that have worked together. They've virtually been professional, what would you say, pair. I mean, they've always worked together very, very productively. Wilma Rudolph and, what was his first name? Remember the Rudolphs. What was his? Suzanne, I'm sorry, not Wilma, Suzanne and, anyway, they're leading scholars in Indian studies at the University of Chicago. They actually both died where I live at Piedmont Gardens in Oakland, California, but that's why I thought of them. But names were always coupled together. They co-authored almost everything they did, and that, it's great if you can do it, but it is a problem in that, you get into, if you try to work on an article together and then you go and try and take care of the kids or clean the house or something, every academic argument becomes a personal argument. Every personal argument comes into an academic argument, and it's tricky. But we probably could have done more together. But we really did benefit a lot from working with other. It's obviously like anything else in marriage. It's being a little tolerant and a little, it's like the main thing. But I think it's great when it can happen, because it's particularly when you're in a foreign country. It's often, it's a cliche about expats in Japan. The husband goes off doing this and that in the daytime and goes out and drinking and all, and the wife stays home and gets drunk at the American club and takes care of the children. And that's a familiar pattern, and you certainly can avoid that. But Ruth really worked hard in Japan. And it had the salutary effect. It was when we were living in Futago Tamagawa. She was working at the Tokyo Metropolitan Institute in Gerontology, which is way the other side of Tokyo in Itabashi-ku. And I was working downtown, but I was doing interviews and stuff, so like most of my life, I really didn't have that much of a schedule. But she was working really till they closed. You felt embarrassed if you left too early in a Japanese organization. So she would be there, and she'd have to go get on 3 trains, right? 3, and a walk to get home. So she'd typically be getting home about 8 o'clock, and or anyway, 7. And if she had to stop along the way and buy something at the store and come home and make it, our kids would have starved already. So I actually kind of learned to cook in that year, and I did most of the sort of, not the fancy cooking, but the day-to-day cooking, and that was a good thing too.
I'll give you some great advice. You could each write each other a positive book review every 2 weeks. One that's very reflective about yourself.
That's a really good idea. Who you could get to publish it, I have no idea, but it is a good idea. Anything else? Did you have a question? Yeah.
Today, thank you very much for your nice, the wonderful, the academic work. And I have a very brief question about social welfare policy. And how do you think about do you know the Shakai Fukushi Hojin? It's one of
Sure.
it's a social, the welfare non-profit organization. How do you think about the contribution of the role of this kind of the non-profit organization? Because U.S. a similar kind of the organization exists, but I think it's a little bit different. Yeah. So could you let me know?
I wasn't anticipating this question. I have to cast my mind back a bit. Shakai Fukushi Hojin would be like many nursing homes are most often run by a Shakai Fukushi Hojin. They can't be for profits, so by law. So they're nonprofits. The criticism has always been they're typically in an area, particularly if you're not in a big city, they're sort of tied in with a whole network. The Shakai Fukushi Kyogikai, the Social Welfare Council, the local Shakai Fukushi Hojin, the local nursing homes and other institutions around, and all of those are in a sense the traditional purveyors of services for older people. And they probably seem a little paternalistic, and in a sense the structure seems a little bit more like the old days when there weren't so many programs, or for that so many old people, and so they have a kind of a fuddy-duddy air to them, some young person. On the other hand, they're the ones that never changed are kind of like that, but it has been a vehicle for people that wanted to do more, and it has enough resources and power. Its money comes from the government, and if you manage well, you can accumulate funds in other ways and start new things. Lots and lots of new programs or new kinds of activities have been started by Shakai Fukushi Hojin because they had some good ideas and experience and knowledge and could do something with it. So their reputation isn't necessarily that good in the normal left-wing literature on the subject, but you can't really imagine anything working in Japan without them, because it's the mainstay of particularly institutional care, but they do a lot of the home care or daycare centers and stuff as well. Ruth was shaking my head at me. Did I cover that okay?
Yeah, I just think that when Kaigo Hoken came out, they really took advantage of it.
Oh, absolutely.
They were able
Thank
to
you.
expand and
Kaigo Hoken, public long-term care insurance, you know, is this, as well as being wonderful for older people and for their caregivers, was this big flood of new resources into the area, and the Shihojin, the organizations that could take advantage of this, really now could do a lot more stuff, and many places really kind of came into their own, and they started doing all sorts of new things. So, and that's, yeah, my view is really quite positive.
one of the reasons that daycare is all over the country.
Japanese, the unusual thing about old age community-based services in Japan is that in most countries of the world, by far the commonest service is home help. The older people lives at home, and someone comes and cleans or takes care of their needs or give their medicine, whatever, gives them a shower. That's by far the commonest. In Japan, there's a lot of it, but it's second to daycare, where people come for 3 or 4 days a week, typically for several hours. They go, have activities, they take a bath, they eat lunch, there's socialization, sort of classes or exercises, and go home again. And there's, you know, in many centers, and you know, those centers had to be started by somebody, and they had to go out and hire them. They're not done by government. They have to basically be done by, can't be done, well, those can be profit making, but so that's some of them, but others of them are Shakai Fukushi Hojin as nonprofits that do it. And so it basically was there was an infrastructure built up before, when the programs were still small, and then when they got big, there was a framework for them to fit into, which would actually, I suppose the same thing could happen in the US, but in the US, everything is so profit-oriented that, you know, people would be quickly looking for ways to game the system and cheat and extract all this money for it. That's kind of an American peculiarity, but Japan is sort of at the opposite end of the scale in that regard, I think. Yeah. That was a good question. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the talk, and sorry I missed the first part of your talk. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about you know, Japan from a comparative perspective, in particular. So I'm asking this particularly because you know, in the comparative politics, there is a literature on sort of like 3 worlds of welfare states, and you
3
know,
worlds of welfare capitalism.
Welfare capitalism, or like a variety of capitalism and things like that. And in that literature, Japan is kind of an important case. And because you're working on like a core sort of policy areas in welfare state, which is medical and pension policies. So I'm wondering how do you see that literature, and like how do you think about sort of you know, Japan in that perspective? Right.
With the sort of 3 worlds of welfare capitalism and streak and all that kind of literature, let me. I've certainly taught that, but it's nothing to do with the kind of research that I do, and let me not get into that side of it. But 3 worlds of welfare, 3 worlds of welfare capitalism. Let me go back. One is a political economy, industrial policy kind of topic. That's what I'm not doing. But Gustav Anderson wrote 3 Worlds of Welfare Capitalism, a famous book that said there's the Scandinavian type, and then there's the liberal type, which is American England, more free market oriented, and then there's the South European type, like Italy and all, that's sort of more family oriented. And he never went to Japan, and then he later wrote an essay that was published in Japanese where he said, well, you know, Japan, it's very small, it doesn't amount to that much, and what there is looks more like familial. But he never studied it or anything, and it raised quite a lot of hackles in Japan, because it was this very influential piece of research, but it wasn't really right. it is, I wrote something someplace or other along the same lines where I said, actually, in some ways, Japan is sort of a mixture of all three. The familial role in Japan used to be dominant, for heaven's sakes. Old people all used to live with their kids, and many still do, but it's gone down like crazy. But to talk about a kind of a reliance on the family, at least historically, was very true in Japan. But on the other hand, through the process I did talk about, the government role, particularly when you look at long-term care and health insurance, but long-term care insurance, but also in the healthcare field, it's a government-run sort of system. On the other hand, most of the doctors and hospitals in Japan are for profit, privately owned. It's not like so there's a lot of market elements in it too. It's a kind of a useless answer, but it's probably true of other countries too. When you take one of these big generalizations and then you look more closely, you see, gee, well, actually it seems to be a little of this and a little of that. The politics of it is well, I probably have to stop and think a bit before. It's been quite a long time since I've worried about, I used to, but since I've worried about that and I don't have it right, I'd have to think a bit before giving you a decent answer.
Okay, I'm afraid we have to close the session. Please join me in thanking Professor John Campbell.